On behalf of the Investor Choice Advocates Network, we are pleased to provide this video to accompany our written feedback on the legislative proposals recently considered by the committee. In our Capital Ideas podcast series, we interview entrepreneurs who are breaking down barriers to capital market access despite the regulatory challenges that exist. Each episode explores practical approaches to navigating complex regulatory landscapes while fostering innovation and inclusion in the financial ecosystem. Here are some highlights where guests discuss the accredited investor definition.
Definition of accredited investor. Because if you're an accredited investor under Rule 501 of the Securities and Exchange Commission rule, you have so many more opportunities to access the capital markets. There's not the same restraints on you, the same paperwork required to disclose on you if you're an accredited investor. And I understand the reason for having that accredited investor definition, but the problem with the definition as it stands right now is I think it assumes that if you're wealthy, then you're knowledgeable, and that is not necessarily true. And so they made changes like in 2020 where I got actually placed as an accredited investor because I have a Series 65 license, but I have been practicing securities law for the last 10 years. And even I didn't qualify as an accredited investor outside of the financial threshold. And I said, that doesn't make sense. Like, I study securities law and I do it every day. And so I think that there is a push. There was a new report that came out from the Small Business Capital Formation that they published on the website. And that was one of the recommendations. It's a recommendation every year, just so we're clear. It's a recommendation every year to update the accredited investor rules. So this is like nothing new. So I don't know if the SEC is going to take that up because they're dealing with crypto and ESG regulation and sort of these other things that I think the commissioners might be focusing on, but that's one of the barriers. Who gets access to capital markets the most? It's accredited investors that is not directly linked to sophistication or the protection I think the SEC is trying to get at, and that's the balance.
Quite a bit of momentum around the idea that the accredited investor financial restrictions need some reform. Among other things, a member of the Senate Banking Committee, Senator Tim Scott, and others on the Senate Banking Committee have proposed legislation that would change accredited investor requirements. Let me ask it this way. Are you in favor of reform of that? And if so, why would it be useful to reform the definition?
Yeah, I think the provision specifically that Senator Scott's bill that interests me the most is this accredited investor exam, which is sort of similar to the exam process that I had to go through to take the Series 65 and get accredited. Broadly, yes, that I'm in favor of reform. Recently wrote an op-ed in The Information arguing for reform. I think the scope of reform, I would say, might be like a little bit less broad than I think most people. I think part of my argument for reform is specifically drawing on my experience living and working in Silicon Valley, where investing in your friends and investing in your coworkers is like a big part of not only the culture, but also I think part of what keeps the ecosystem here going, where there's people who are willing to bet on you before you just have an idea. And to the extent that like an exam or something like that would make becoming accredited easier for people who are knowledgeable and know what they're doing but don't meet the financial requirements, I'm in favor of that.
Well, so about the accredited and what you said there, I just want to say, and I don't know if you guys talk about this a lot, but where do you draw the line? How is it that somebody can go onto Coinbase or one of these exchanges and buy something called dog with hat and put an unlimited amount of money into this thing for unknown whatever happens? How is that okay? But somebody investing $5,000 into, hey, I think this thing called Google is a good idea. No. You must meet this qualification to do that. Why is that the way that it is? So I don't know. I'm curious if that's something that ICAN is actually out to, is there legislation here? I know that it's loosened up as far as accreditor investor rules over the years. Right now, you can have certain FINRA designations. You can pass some licensing sort of things and become accredited in other ways. So it has to be like going this way eventually, but just kind of like who's advocating for it and what's okay. And by democratizing the access to it for the people building on it, like you're saying, they can actually access capital quicker, okay? and like more so on their own terms or their own timeline. Okay, it's more of a market, a true marketplace.
So I think we need to like address the, the gray areas for the platforms that are out there as well. I think for the investors, accredited investors can do so much. And I think that's great. They can write these big checks. And we've got these workarounds going on now where, let's do a parallel offering. So we've got, a Reg CF and a Reg D. And then, we'll put all the accredited investors. I mean, do we really need to? Because it's just an added layer of bureaucracy. It's an added layer of cost. You can try and stop it, but if there are you can try and stop it, but if there's current regulatory structures that allow you to do what you want to do, people will do it.
It's a big problem, and for a long time, in order to invest in private companies, you needed to be an accredited investor. So, our government was saying, look, unless you have millions of dollars, you're too stupid to invest in private companies, which are the greatest wealth creators in the history of humanity.
So a lot of what the SEC does doesn't really touch directly on small businesses. They are mostly focused on public companies and on investment funds. So one of the areas that's been talked about the committee multiple times throughout the years is the accredited investor definition. Interestingly, that does seem to be a bipartisan issue on the committee. I would say people kind of both ways in terms of their politics, but who are in the small business world tend to support broadening of the accredited investor definition, even though, congressionally it tends to be more politically divided, but I would say the committee is a little bit different that way. So that's kind of interesting because people who are kind of in the business world don't necessarily see it as a political issue. They see it more as what can practically help small businesses. And the thinking around that, it is multidimensional. I've learned a lot from my peers on the committee. It's not just the money limits themselves that can be a barrier for investing, but it's sort of the implications. A lot of times diverse founders don't have as high net worth networks. And so having those requirements to only market to accredited investors, if you're a startup, a diverse founder, minority founder who doesn't necessarily have, lots of accredited investors in your network, can be much more limiting than if you could actually market and more broadly, and maybe, people might put in smaller amounts, but you have the ability to market to those.
The last 10 years has been a fascinating, almost experiment, I'll call it. When the Jobs Act was enacted by the SEC, it allowed private companies to raise from the public. And so what we've seen is a lot of companies, as well as certain sectors or verticals, really leaning into this idea of community and raising from their community, activating their community. And that's been really fascinating from my perspective, because these are true retail investors. And oftentimes when we talk about it, I mean retail with a little r, not accredited or quibs or any of those other retail terms that we might say in financial services, but true unaccredited investors being able to invest in companies that they feel are really going to make a difference in the world, that they're really excited about. And we're seeing certain companies really galvanize that community and help them on their journey.
But really, the person it hurts is a little guy, because his choices are limited in what he or she can get into or interest in. And then, also, to add it a little bit further, I mean, look at the rules around accreditation. I know a lot of people that are, pretty wealthy, but the guy that makes a lot less than they are, that's considered non-accredited, knows a hell of a lot more, probably does more research, and given the resources that you have online, there's, what should we do about that? To me, it should be, either you sign off or there's a test base or something besides just saying, oh, you're not, because you don't make, a certain amount of money, or your family doesn't make a certain amount of money, that makes you stupid. I find that, I mean, why should I be restricted as a smaller investor, being able to take on some of the opportunities that the big boys have?
One of the things you've been outspoken about that I think touches on both of those is the accredited investor definition, and how that might inhibit people below a certain net worth or income level from participating in these. And that's something you've talked about. Can you just comment a little bit about the accredited investor rule and how it might impact what you're doing?
This is a concept that I've talked to and testified in front of Congress about because it's so important that we start thinking about, we keep using the stat about less than 1%. Okay, less than 2% of women are getting investment. Less than 1% of Black and brown people are getting investment. Okay, well, we can't also say less than 1% of people are actually able to be accredited investors and then think that definition, that equity is going to somehow appear, right? So I think that there's one argument about, oh, well, investors need to become more equitable and we need more transparency around who's investing in what and how. I think that makes sense, but I also think we need to think about how can we let more people in? What does it mean to open up that door a little bit more? If we can trust people to gamble their money away, then how can we look at more people that we could trust to actually invest and trust them to be smart and financially adept? The definition part of the definition that says you have to have $1 million, or you can have $1 million net worth. When I questioned this around, like, well, where did $1 million come from? Like, why did all of a sudden having $1 million meant you were somehow financially smart?
So I might not, in fact, be an accredited investor, and yet I have participated in the ecosystem. I am a fintech entrepreneur. I'm a thought leader in this space. I probably think about and talk about this stuff more than most people, and yet I would not be necessarily considered an accredited investor under the rules as they stand. So there is a real necessity to think about who is not only an accredited investor by the rules in terms of net worth, but also in terms of who's a sophisticated investor.